This is BBC One. So now, live coverage of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother's funeral service at Westminster Abbey and her final journey back to Windsor Castle.
David Dimbleby will be looking back at the day's events in a special programme tonight on BBC One at 9 o'clock. This is BBC One. Now the news with Anna Ford. Looking back at the day's events, David Dimbleby introduces a special programme tonight at 9 o'clock here on BBC One. This is BBC One. If you saw the BBC's documentary on the life of the Queen Mother in the last week, you'll know how much she enjoyed Dad's Army. So now a chance to enjoy again a particular favourite with the Royal Train bound for Wilmington-on-Sea. This is BBC One. Doctors returns tomorrow at 2:10. Now a moment for some Antiques Roadshow gems. Tuesday afternoon on BBC One. Are you ready? It's time for CBeebies. And this is BBC One. This is BBC One. Now the news with Hugh Edwards and Emily Maitlis. It's 6 o'clock.
Now on BBC One, BBC London News. Or for other local programmes, press the red button on your remote control. Later tonight, there's a look back at the funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. That's at 9 o'clock here on BBC One. Welcome to Tuesday night on BBC One.
Watchdog on your side in the High Street.
You think this is all about you and Steve? When are you going to start looking after the things that really matter?
This is ridiculous indeed. Do you have any idea what happened to me last night?
And that's the shape of the next 2 hours. So now on BBC One, it's the Consumer's Champion. A change to the schedule later on BBC One as we look back at the funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. That's at 9 o'clock. The return of a familiar face. David Soul is back in Holby City on BBC One after EastEnders.
Next on BBC One.
It was inappropriate for you to have been caught with cannabis on your person and even more so to have contested matters. Your behaviour could well bring this hospital into considerable disrepute. Please. And you may consider yourself fortunate that this is not an official verbal warning.
Holby City next on BBC One.
BBC Two tastes great for the next hour with The Naked Chef and Gary Rhodes. The All-American Sweetheart, Doris Day, is BBC One's Hollywood Great at 10:35. This is BBC One, looking back at today's events at Westminster Abbey, marking the funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother. Introduced by David Dimbleby. This is BBC One. Now, Michael Burke with the BBC 10 o'clock news. BBC One continuing the series of Hollywood greats. Next Tuesday it's Tony Curtis, but now the bright lights fall on America's Girl Next Door. Added punch now on BBC One, a classic triple Oscar-winning movie. Sly Stallone hits the big time in Rocky. And you look to tonight's Sign Zone here on BBC One. See Here will now be earlier than planned in a few minutes. And then we look back at the life of the Queen Mother in a special two-part tribute from 2 o'clock. Now on BBC One, the Weatherview with Helen Willits. Welcome to BBC One's Sign Zone. The lineup tonight has changed. There's now a special two-part tribute to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, starting at 2 o'clock. Before that on BBC One, earlier than planned, See Here. Further change to the schedule now on BBC One, with signing and subtitles, a special two-part celebration of the life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Now on BBC One, straight on to the second part, with signing and subtitles of a special tribute to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Now on BBC One, we join BBC News 24.